Konstantin Semyonovich Dayev hears it before he sees it, a low vibration through the frozen earth, traveling up through his boots, through his knees, into his chest. It is July 13th, 1943, and the grass on the Kursk steppe smells of fire and cooling steel, and somewhere beyond the ridge, something enormous is moving toward him. He is a gunner, 23 years old. He has not slept in 31 hours. The inside of the fighting compartment smells of propellant and sweat, and the particular copper and oil smell that Soviet armored vehicles never lose no matter how many times you scrub them. He presses his eye to the sight. His hands are absolutely still, and then he sees it. A Tiger. Turret number 312. Moving at a walking pace, unhurried, because its crew believes nothing on this battlefield can touch it at this range. They are wrong. Dayev speaks one word to his loader. The loader grabs a shell the size of a small child and weighs 48 kilograms. He does not so much load it as fall forward with it, slamming it home with his whole body weight. The breech closes. Dayev adjusts 2 degrees left. He breathes out. He fires. What happens next is not an explosion in the conventional sense. The 152 millimeter projectile does not penetrate the Tiger's armor so much as abolish it. The entire commander's cupola separates from the turret ring jams, the vehicle stops. 3 seconds later, the ammunition inside begins to cook off, and the Tiger's turret lifts 4 meters into the air on a column of orange fire and lands 30 meters away in a wheat field that will not be harvested that year or the next. Dayev does not cheer. He is already loading the second round. The machine he is sitting inside weighs 45 tons and carries the largest gun ever mounted on a Soviet armored vehicle to that point in the war. The Germans, who pride themselves on precise military vocabulary, will abandon precision entirely when describing what it does to their tanks. They will call it simply the Zveroboy, the beast killer, and they will mean it the way a man means something when he has run out of other words. The story of how that machine came to exist in that field on that morning begins not with triumph, but with catastrophe. And the catastrophe begins not with one failure, but with a long, unbroken chain of them, stretching back through 2 years of Soviet armor burning on every road from Brest to the Volga. By the autumn of 1942, the mathematics of the Eastern Front had become unbearable. The Red Army had lost over 20,000 armored vehicles since June 1941, not all of them to enemy fire. Many simply broke. Many were abandoned for lack of fuel. Many were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. But the ones that mattered, the ones that shaped strategy and ended careers and kept certain Soviet generals awake at 3 a.m, were the ones destroyed by German armor that Soviet guns could not touch. The Panzer IV, with its long 75 millimeter gun, could kill a T-34 at 1,200 meters. The T-34's 76 millimeter gun struggled to kill a Panzer IV at 500. This was not a small disadvantage. This was a death sentence issued at range, and the crews who understood the geometry of it, who could calculate in a fraction of a second what it meant when a German tank stopped moving and turned toward them, lived with a very specific and very rational terror. Then the Tiger arrived. The Tiger one, with its 100 millimeter of frontal armor and its 88 millimeter gun, was not merely better than the T-34. It was a different category of problem. Soviet anti-tank guns that had performed adequately against earlier German armor simply failed against it. The standard 76 millimeter round struck the Tiger's glacis plate and fell away. The 85 millimeter anti-aircraft gun mounted on an improvised carriage could do the job, but only from the flank, only at close range, and only if the crew survived long enough to get into position, which they frequently did not. At the Battle of Leningrad's southern approaches in late 1942, Soviet tank brigades reported engaging Tigers at ranges under 200 meters with their main guns and watching the rounds bounce. One brigade commander's after-action report, preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, contains a sentence that military historians still quote, "Our shells do not penetrate. Our men die. We require something else entirely." The Panther was coming too. Soviet intelligence knew it. The new German tank would carry frontal armor that made the Tiger look approachable. Something had to be done before the summer of 1943, when every officer on the Soviet side understood the Germans would strike again, and strike with everything they had. The answer came from a man who had been thinking about the wrong problem, which is frequently how the right answer arrives. Lev Troyanov was not looking for a tank destroyer. He was chief designer at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, deep in the Ural Mountains, and he had spent 1942 trying to improve the KV-1S heavy tank, which was itself an improvement on the KV-1, which had been an attempt to fix the problems of the earlier KV series, and none of it was working. The KV line was heavy, expensive, mechanically unreliable, and in the field, the crews hated it with the particular hatred reserved for machines that get you killed through incompetence rather than enemy action. Troyanov and his team were standing around the hulk of a KV-1S1. November morning in 1942, in a factory courtyard where the temperature had dropped to minus 38 Celsius, which at that temperature means the grease in the wheel bearings had solidified and the metal had contracted enough to open hairline cracks in the welds, when one of his junior engineers said something that changed the war. He said, "We have the KV hull. We have the ML-20 howitzer. The howitzer already exists. The ammunition already exists. Why are we inventing something new when we could simply put the thing we have inside the thing we already have?" The ML-20 152mm gun howitzer was not a new weapon. It had been in Soviet service since 1937. Artillery crews called it reliable the way you call a working dog reliable, not affectionately, but with complete confidence. It fired a shell weighing 43.5 kilograms. Its muzzle velocity with armor-piercing ammunition was 600 meters per second. At close range against armored vehicles, the effect was not penetration in the technical sense, but something closer to structural erasure. The problem was fitting it. The ML-20 was a field artillery piece. It was enormous. Mounting it in an armored vehicle meant building a completely new superstructure, redesigning the fighting compartment, solving the recoil problem from scratch, and doing all of this while the factory was simultaneously producing tanks for a front that was consuming them faster than they could be built. Troyanov's team did it in 25 days, not a rough prototype. A working vehicle designated the KV-14 in development and later redesignated the SU-152. The superstructure was a fixed casemate, meaning the gun could not rotate independently of the vehicle, but at 152 millimeters, this barely mattered. You did not need to aim precisely at which part of a tiger you wished to destroy. You simply needed to be in the same approximate area. The fighting compartment held a crew of 5, commander, gunner, 2 loaders, and driver. It needed 2 loaders because the rounds were too heavy for one man to handle under combat conditions. Each shell weighed more than most of the men handling it. The rate of fire in combat was approximately 2 rounds per minute, which sounds slow until you understand what each round did. If stories like this one have stayed with you, there are more of them. Subscribing means you will never watch the wrong one first. The vehicle weighed 45.5 tons. It was 8.95 meters long, 3.25 meters wide, 2.45 meters tall. Armor protection on the front was 75 millimeters, angled to increase effective thickness. The engine was the same V2 diesel used in the T-34, producing 600 horsepower. Maximum road speed was 43 kilometers per hour. Cross-country range was approximately 145 kilometers, which was enough to get to the battle and enough to get out of it, which is precisely the range a vehicle like this required. The first prototype fired its initial test rounds at the Chelyabinsk Proving Ground in January 1943. The test crew, none of whom had fired anything larger than an 85mm gun before, described the experience as standing inside a bell when someone strikes it. The entire vehicle moved backward on its suspension with each shot. Empty shell casings the size of waste bins ejected into a compartment already thick with propellant smoke. The ventilation system, which was inadequate, became immediately and obviously inadequate. They fixed the ventilation. They accepted everything else. On February 14, 1943, the SU-152 entered production. On March 20, 1943, the 1st Regiment equipped with SU-152s departed for the front. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Kursk was the proving ground and the proof simultaneously. Operation Citadel, launched on July 5, 1943. The German plan was to pinch off the Kursk salient with simultaneous drives from north and south, destroying the Soviet forces inside and restoring the initiative on the Eastern Front. To do it, they committed 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including 134 Tigers, 200 Panthers making their combat debut, and the enormous Elefant tank destroyer, which carried an 88mm gun behind 200mm of armor, and which German commanders believed was essentially impervious to anything the Soviets could field. The 1,529th Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment, equipped with SU-152s, was positioned in the southern sector of the salient near Prokhorovka. Their orders were simple in language and brutal in implication. Stop the Tigers. On the 8th of July, 1943, the regiment encountered a column of Tigers and Panthers near the village of Oboyan. The range closed to under 800 meters before the SU-152 crews opened fire. What the German tank crews experienced in the next 11 minutes has been described in debriefing documents captured after the war, and the language in those documents is not the language of professional soldiers describing a tactical setback. It is the language of men who encountered something they did not believe existed. A Tiger struck by an SU-152 round at close range did not burn in the normal sense. The concussive force of the impact, even without penetration, was sufficient to kill the crew through internal overpressure. When penetration did occur, the round carried so much energy that secondary fragmentation inside the vehicle was total. Surviving German accounts describe finding tanks with the interior surfaces coated in a fine metallic mist that had once been the ammunition stowage. Turrets were found hundreds of meters from the hulls they had sat on. One Elefant, struck twice in the superstructure, was found with its 65-ton hull rolled onto its side by the force of the secondary explosion. By the end of the Kursk offensive, the 1,529th Regiment had destroyed an exact figure that remains disputed in the surviving records, but post-war analysis suggests approximately 12 Tigers and 7 Panthers confirmed, with additional probables. More significant than the number was the effect on German tactical behavior. Tiger crews, who had by mid-1943 developed a working confidence in their vehicles' invulnerability at standard combat ranges, began requesting information about what weapon was killing them. When the answer filtered back through German intelligence channels, the response at divisional level was to order Tigers to maintain greater distance from the Soviet lines, which is a tactful military way of saying the crews were afraid. The Elefant, which entered Kursk with such confidence, was withdrawn from the Eastern Front after suffering catastrophic losses, many attributed to SU-152 fire. It would return in modified form in Italy, but it never again served on the front where it had been designed to dominate. The Germans had nothing directly equivalent. Their Jagd Panzer series carried powerful guns, but the 88mm PaK-43, while lethal against Soviet armor, did not produce the same structural devastation at close range. The Stu-G3, Germany's workhorse assault gun, used a 75mm weapon entirely outclassed by the Soviet 152mm. The Hummel self-propelled howitzer carried a 150mm gun similar in caliber to the SU-152, but it was an artillery vehicle with minimal armor, not a weapon designed for direct fire against tanks. There was no German equivalent of a vehicle that combined heavy armor with a weapon capable of destroying any tank on the battlefield in a single shot from a realistic combat range. The Soviets themselves recognized the SU-152 was not a perfect weapon. The fixed superstructure meant the entire vehicle had to turn to track a fast-moving target. The rate of fire was low enough that a missed shot could be fatal in a close engagement. The crew compartment was cramped, the visibility poor, the ventilation perpetually insufficient. Loader casualties were high, partly because the physical demands of handling 48-kilogram shells under combat stress, in a space the size of a garden shed, with a gun recoiling 6 times a minute, were extreme. Production continued through 1943 before transitioning to the ISU-152, which mounted the same gun on the heavier IS tank chassis, improving armor protection to 90mm on the hull front and 60mm on the superstructure sides. The SU-152 would serve through the fall of Berlin in May 1945, used in the street fighting for which it proved unexpectedly suited. A 152mm round fired down a city street does not need to hit a specific target. 4 surviving SU-152s exist in the world today. 3 are in Russia, 1 at the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow, 1 at Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, and 1 at the museum at Prokhorovka, which sits on the ground where it fought. The 4th is in private hands in a location that changes periodically, as these things do. The engineers who designed it in 25 days in a Ural winter received the Stalin Prize, first class, in 1943. Lev Troyanov survived the war and continued designing armored vehicles until 1969. Whether he knew, in that freezing courtyard in November 1942, what the question his engineer had asked would eventually produce, no record confirms. What the record confirms is that somewhere between that conversation and a wheat field outside Oboyan, a Tiger turned its turret toward a Soviet vehicle and fired, and the round struck the SU-152's superstructure at 900 meters and left a dent 23 millimeters deep, and the SU-152 fired back. The Tiger did not fire again. Dayev, if the records are correct, survived Kursk. He survived the drive to the Dnieper. He survived the winter of 1943 and the summer of 1944. What he thought about in those long hours between engagements, sitting inside a metal box that smelled of propellant and sweat, and that particular copper and oil smell, is not recorded. What is recorded is that he kept loading the gun, that he kept breathing out before he fired, that his hands remained still. Some men are afraid and do it anyway. Some machines are imperfect and win anyway. At Kursk, in the summer of 1943, on a step that still holds the steel of 10,000 vehicles in its black soil, the SU-152 did something that no amount of engineering specification can fully explain. It made the men inside the Tigers afraid. And once you have done that, once you have turned the hunters into the hunted, the war has already changed, even if nobody has written it down yet. The beast killer earned its name. The men who gave it that name knew exactly what they mean.